Okay, looks like everybody's connected. So good morning, I'm Laura Kennedy, the lower school director. Nice to see you all here today. Today's talk is about raising the next generation of digital citizens. I'm really happy. We had a great meeting last week for K-2 parents. And so I'm really happy to introduce Joe Carver, who is our Chief Innovation Officer, who started here in January. He spent many years at, well, I'll let you introduce yourself, Joe, but technology expert, has presented all over the country and did a really great presentation for parents last week. This is being recorded, so if you do have to step out, you can get back to it at any time, and there will be plenty of time at the end for question and answers. But Joe, I'm going to pass it over to you to introduce yourself and get started.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that Ms. Kennedy did an apt job introducing me. I'm Joe. And I do a lot of these conversations. I have them with a lot of students and a lot of parents. I come by this path a little bit indirectly. I started as an argumentation instructor and interpersonal communications teacher. It wasn't until around 2000 that I really pivoted. Despite having grown up in Silicon Valley, I really pivoted towards an interest in the way that technology affected relationships. And that's guided sort of the last 21 years. And I was reflecting this morning on how different this conversation is than it was even a couple of years ago. And I think that you'll find that that's going to be the theme today. I will say before I start screen sharing that I think that the conversation that we had last week was a really great introduction to the way that I would hope parents would think about devices in their children. So if you weren't there and you have the opportunity to go back, where I know they're going to send out the video, I would encourage you to watch it. I know it's a lot of me to deal with, but you could break it up over weeks if that's easiest for you. I just think there's some information in there that's hopefully worth sharing. So I'm going to share my screen now and we'll get started. And as Ms. Kennedy said, there will be ample time at the end to ask questions, I hope. All right. Hopefully we've got a screen share now. And Ms. Kennedy introduced us. So let's get started with a discussion about what our purpose is today. The first is that we're a little bit more, the idea of talking about digital citizenship and our children is such a broad conversation. We could probably spend weeks and weeks discussing it. So we've had to choose sort of narrow and focus on what we think is really impacting your children's age group right now. But my hope is that this is the first of a number of conversations that we have over time. About the way that devices impact our children, whether it's in the academic setting or at home. But today we'll largely focus on the tides and trends occurring with social media. And I was a little bit torn on how best to present this. I should say, first of all, the spoiler alert at the start of this is you're going to find that I'm not a particular advocate of most social media. And we'll talk about the why. But what I wanted to do is make sure that the things that we discussed came from a place that we could at least at a start agree with. And so I was torn with that because I think that all families come to our community with all sorts of different family values and all sorts of different constructions and all sorts of different needs as a family. So the one thing I thought that might be helpful for all of us is if we looked at social media through the lens of what Meadows' core values are, because as an entry point for a conversation, that's one thing that we all know and that we've all come to agree on. We decided collectively as your teachers, your administrators, the parents, your children, that these were the things that we were going to send our children to an academic environment in hopes that they could support and instill. So if this tool or these tools somehow impacts those core values, then that's something I think that we can all start with as a point of conversation. So you'll find as we make our way through that the focus is on looking at these through that these tools through that lens. And then finally, and I put this at the top because I used to trust my ability to really land a point in conversation. As I get a little bit older, I'm not as sure I'm as sharp, so I like to just say it outright. The takeaway from this conversation is that you need to be lifelong technology learners if you want to help your children navigate the environment that they're going to live in. And so those are the three goals in the start of today's conversation. Let's go to the typical usage of students your age. And I want to talk about some of these. I think that most of them you're probably familiar with. And so the first is the gaming, which is typically the most natural starting point for children when they come into a social media environment is it starts with gaming. They start by downloading an app to an appliance, whether it's an iPad or mom and dad's phone, and they play on that. That is social. It is a social tool because it brings people from one side of the world to the other side into shared spaces. And depending on the level of advancement that they have, it can include chat features, conversational tools. So we will talk a little bit about those. The second area of usage that I think we need to discuss today is chat. And I think this is a particularly interesting one to discuss because at the start of the pandemic, the chat tools in our students' devices, in our children's devices, were in many ways considered to be critical to their emotional development. We went from a scenario where they were spending 8 hours a day with their friends on playgrounds and in classrooms and in libraries and all those things, to being completely isolated in their homes. And so what happened was there was a massive uptick in the use of various chat functions. And for our generation, yours and mine, we might think of chat as something more like texting or instant messaging. But now the trend is towards voice chat applications. And those voice chat applications are, things like Clubhouse and Discord. And if you're not familiar with those two, then you're definitely in the right place, because these are tools that started with a lot of promise, even just a year and a half ago. I think it was probably 8 or 9 months that Clubhouse was in the top 5 social media apps being downloaded in the iOS store. It's dropped to like 24th or 25th. It started with this incredible trajectory of this is helping our children. It's giving them a chance to communicate with each other. And like so many of these tools, what happened was that interest sort of faded. And then it got taken over by a combination of either monetization or people who we can say as, people that are there not for the right reasons. So it's sort of become a hotbed for racism and some of the darker sides of the internet. The third category that our kids our age are using a lot now is AV consumption. And I specify consumption here because I think that there's a subtle difference between creation and consumption. We can talk about it and deconstruct the idea of being a creator on the internet later. It's certainly worthy of its own talk because it comes with a ton of baggage and mischaracterizations of what it really means to create something. But for now, we can let it rest with the idea that, YouTube, TikTok, and Netflix, reason I identified these three is because they have one thing in common, and that's that they all have suggestive listing, which is to say that when you watch something on one of these sites, it creates a list for you that says, I bet you want to watch this too. And we say, well, I think I probably do, and click it and keep going. And if you've ever allowed your child to be on YouTube and watching a video, you can see how a matter of a 3-minute video can descend into an hour or an hour and a half down what they refer to as the rabbit hole. Although children know how to navigate their way through YouTube far sooner than they understand the reference navigating through a rabbit hole, which is in and of itself a concern. So social media, traditional social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, all of them, we will probably focus most of our attention on when we get to the core value discussion, but I think that they're important. What I think is important as parents to understand about these social media tools is that if you are addressing behavior by tool, you are likely behind. So I've said to Ms. Kennedy on a couple of occasions that I'm not a big fan of these technology conversations with parents, because too often experts get on and they say, I'm going to tell you how to navigate Facebook so that you can know exactly what your child is doing. And, in the back of the room, there's a snicker because every child knows they're not really using Facebook anymore. By that point, they'd moved on to Snapchat. And by the time we parents caught on to Snapchat, they were using Discord. And so the idea of developing a sort of tool-based set of solutions is a flawed approach, because what we really need to develop is a set of questions that we ask ourselves about everything before we let it become a part of our children's lives. And then the last category, subscription services, I put there just so that you're aware, because often we subscribe to, bundling is a big term in the ecosystems these days. And so in Apple, you might subscribe to, I got Apple Fitness, and because I had Apple Music, it let me bundle all their services. Well, that also bundled in Apple TV and Apple Arcade, which are huge time consumers of children. And while they might be less nefarious and dangerous than some of the other tools like Discord or even TikTok, they certainly suck up an inordinate amount of our time. The number on the side of the screen is the average American student between 5 and 10 years old spends 4 hours and 44 minutes online a day. And that's a startling number when we think about it. And there are certainly, if we want to parse the numbers, we could get that down to a much more navigatable number in terms of time they spend on social media, because this number includes things like time you might spend at school working on devices under the effective tutelage of someone like Ms. Friedman that is productive and great for your child. But we know in our heart of hearts as parents that that's not all of it, right? Some of that is the time when you're in the car and you need it to be quiet. And some of that's the time when they get home from school and we tell ourselves, well, they need to decompress, so it's okay to have a 45 minutes or hours, when really it might be us who really needs the time to decompress. So we know that this number may vary for you, but at the end of the day, the general takeaway is probably a bit too much. All right, I'm having a slide change. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the documentary, The Social Dilemma. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to watch it, of course, on one of these streaming services, which will make a number of suggestions to you about other things to watch. But just watch this one. The founders of the Center for Humane Technology made The Social Dilemma. And the founders of the Center for Humane Technology were all Silicon Valley folks who worked in the creation of social media applications. Some of them worked in larger ecosystems like Google, but mostly they came from places like Facebook, Snapchat, TikTok. What they recognized, and what this quote reflects, is that the tools that were developed, Facebook, TikTok, had a developed purpose, i.e., let's create an app that allows people to share coordinated, fun, how-to videos and share them with people all over the world. And that's an innocent enough goal when it comes to the creation of an app. And a number of you have probably seen The Social Network, or not The Social Network, but the Facebook film that charted its rise to prominence and made the Winklevoss twins part of our collective consciousness. But so you know that Facebook obviously also wasn't started with the idea of how do we make $1 billion. But anywhere where millions of people gather, the market will always say, well, there must be some way for us to monetize this. And so as the quote says, under immense pressure to prioritize engagement and growth, technology platforms have created a race for human attention that's unleashed invisible harms to society, which sounds sort of terrifying. But I think that perhaps a more apt description for children our age, again, I'm still having problems with my slides. Oh, you know what? I'm going to have to leave presenter mode for 1 second to get you back. All right, hopefully you're back now. Sorry about that. I'm getting sticky slide syndrome here. So to make it more simple than their quote, I think that you can always remember this one. If you didn't pay for the product, then you are the product. So this has been a clumsy metaphor that's been used in the social media world for a while. It's not always an analog to what we do, but as a general rule, the way that social media developed started with a series of free apps people joined. The initial wave of monetization, in other words, the initial drive for means of making this a moneymaker was, let's put ads on. So you just started getting bombarded with ads. So Facebook would just get ads after ads after ads. And you know what they realized was those ads, without the proper direction and focus, drove users away. So that was generation one. But generation two took a closer look at monetization and said, what if we didn't just blast ads out the way that magazines do? The way that someone says, well, if Rolling Stone goes to music fans, then I can put a guitar ad in and maybe I get X% response. What if we, instead of thinking about it that way, what if we monitored what it took to keep someone on a page? What sort of insights are required to keep somebody watching a video? How do we take somebody who would watch the one cooking video that they came looking for and keep them there for 45 minutes? And they started to collect that information in data terms, figuring out how end users like you or your children would get trapped into an ecosystem. They could then take that data and provide that data to companies that were looking to figure out how to also gather your attention. So it was different than just blasting you with ads. It was different than having one article in a page or in a magazine and then turning and going through 3 pages of ads that you could just blast through. They were literally using artificial intelligence to fine tune what it took to keep your attention, because your attention became a value to the folks that were monetizing their businesses. The same is true of your children. So when we download, and I'll use my own daughter as an example, when I download the Strawberry Shortcake app for her iPad, they're monitoring how long she plays with the free level 1. And then they say, well, look, after 25 minutes of level 1, we lost 30% of our kids. What do we do to bring those kids back? Well, what if we have an enhancement after 25 minutes of playing? Then you get another tool. Oh, you can play with this now. Then, oh, well, what if we get them to an hour? Well, if we get them over an hour, then they're more likely to buy the paid version. Oh, okay, well, let's figure out how to stretch that out. This happens for children's games. It also happens for adults. It's quite simple. Facebook, Instagram, all of them know the algorithm. If you're on for 7 days and you connect with 7 people, it was called the rule of 7, that the likelihood that you would stay on that app and it would become a part of your phone's ecosystem increased by some exponential number. So the first thing they did when you joined those apps was make suggestions, right? Hey, here are 25 of your friends that are on Instagram. They know the moment that they get you connected with 7, then you will be a customer. And once you're a customer, you can be sold to. And so I, as you know, every American, I might have misgivings about various aspects of capitalism, but the one thing that I'm okay with is a consumer making an informed decision about what they're buying. The problem is with our children, ages 7 to 10 or 11 years old, so very many of them have absolutely no idea what they're buying. So very many of our parents have no idea what they're buying. So the goal is to get a better understanding of what the implications of joining these things are. So let's take a moment and just talk about how the social media tools affect our children from the core values perspective of the Meadows School. The very first, and one of the ones that drew me to this school, and I think that if you travel around the country, that Meadows' reputation is always brought back to scholarship. Everyone who knows the school around the country and in independent schools refers to it, with its academic prowess. So seemingly parents who choose to send their children there are hoping to develop young scholars. Well, the reality of social media tools like Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, TikTok is their goal is the exact opposite. While it is true that there are elements inside social media that are educational and things that you can learn from, the question that you should ask is social media a necessary and sufficient tool to achieve that end? In other words, my child learned how to do X. Could they have done that without joining social media, subjecting all of their data to these companies, and also feeling the impact of the things that we're going to talk about now? So for one, I'd like to say for all of the articles that we talk about today that you have these quotes, they're all from peer research journals. So as you know, thanks largely to social media, I could find an article on the internet that says just about anything within a few minutes. And so one of the tools that we use to make sure that it's quality information is we look for peer-reviewed journals. So this particular peer-reviewed journal realized that students in the primary school age who had social media tasks and were charted using social media showed a decrease in arithmetic cognition within 1 month. The reverse of that was not true, meaning that once they had lost that and they removed social media from the equation, their neuroplasticity did not reflect their ability to catch back up. So what we know about that is that our children have a ability to focus on certain tools. They have a built-in set neurological skill set, and it's their job and our job as educators to help them grow that, right? What this study indicated was that while we are working hard, while parents are working hard to develop our kids' ability to pay attention and their ability to learn, these tools are decreasing that exact same skill at the same time. And how are they doing that? Well, they're doing it with simple things. Like you may have noticed that when you get an alert on your phone, it comes in the color red. Did you ever wonder why it comes in the color red? The reason it's red is because red is an alert color, and we're programmed to believe that when we see something red, it requires our immediate attention. So when you get a red alert on your phone that says 2 is text messages, of course you click it, right? So we are being taught to have our attention diverted by someone whose best interest might not be our own. Another great example of this, the sort of insidious nature of these things, is the way that the phone makers and the ecosystem designers for these made it certain that one of the original core functions of the phone was to be an alarm clock. And while that might seem like, well, that's a good idea, 2 in 1, I've got my phone and my alarm clock. Well, what else was the outgrowth of that behavior? Well, the phone sits on your bedstand and you set your alarm and it wakes you up. And if you want to turn it off, that means you have to pick up your device. And not that many of us pick up our device, turn the alarm off, and then go back to living. We all immediately start right into that flume, checking those red alerts. What those things do ultimately is stop us from being mindful about the actions that we're taking and cause us to just respond, call and response, call and response. And call and response decreases various forms of cognition in young children. The second core value I want to talk about is character. So there are 2 things that I'd like to talk to you about this one. This one's a bit scary, and I don't want it to just be scary, but I do want you to understand how these things work. The first is you have to understand that you're starting on a character, from a character standpoint, at a disadvantage to social media. Statistically, in America, a child between the ages of 5 and 11 spends twice as much time on their device a day as they do talking to a family member. Okay, so and that's not a number that's given without judgment. It's not that we aren't talking to our children. It's that they are spending an astronomical amount of time being exposed to these devices. So 2 times. So you get literally half the opportunity to provide your child character as the internet is being given in the status quo. So who are we handing that over to? Well, we're handing it over to companies that have already told Congress that they are not interested in agenda setting, that they are not interested in taking responsibility for the quality or the accuracy of the information that is shared on their sites. Okay, so this study that originally came out of the Wall Street Journal is a fascinating study, and I will provide all these links to you at the end. But it came from an internal memo from Facebook, where they recognized that their algorithm was being used to target particular ages to push into their feed extremist groups' messages. And I think that we all have seen this, whether it was a course of the pandemic, whether it was a course of George Floyd, whether it was a course of any of these other issues that have taken a life on their own in social media. The false flag claims that happened at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. I was in South Florida when that happened. And there were people living within 15 miles of that school that believed that that attack didn't happen. So all of those were things that happened via social media. So when this number indicated that 64% of people who were recruited into extremist groups found those groups through their feeds, that's not the same thing as your child going and looking up false flag Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. They opened their device to see what their friends were doing, to see if anybody posted a picture of them, to see who might be, new friends that they might have joined, and that's what they found. I've heard comedian Mark Maron say that the brain cannot be thrown like a boomerang, that at some point you throw it far enough out and it doesn't come back. And that's the risk that social media poses to character. The fact that it already has a 2-to-1 advantage over us and has publicly said, we have no interest in agenda setting. We're not the moral police. We're not going to try to regulate the behaviors that are happening on our sites. These are all reasons that it makes it harder to build young people of great character who also spend so much time in social media. Inclusion is obviously a focal point for all schools and all families right now. It's interesting about the impact that social media has on inclusion is that it reduces in so many ways our view of people as one-dimensional. Now, you'd think that the evolution of social media would have improved upon that, because while it might have started that it was our life in 160 characters on Twitter, we're now in a place where we can do video. We can share video. We can chat live. We can voice chat. We can, in some of these, well, I'll use FaceTime, the Apple term, but we can have face-to-face conversations. But the reality is that we know that the more exposure people have through technology to other people, the more reduced the likelihood is that they will interpret them as warm and intelligent. And I'm telling you something that as parents, you all know, right? We just know that the science now bears out that when we stand across the room from someone and listen to them explain their experiences to us, it is far more difficult to be dismissive. So from just purely a procedural standpoint, if we're in the room with someone, our only option is to stand up and walk out. And we're not going to stand up and walk out in most instances unless something terrible happens. But how easy is it to retreat back in social media to the people that we know, to the people that we understand, to the systems that we feel like are our comfort zones? Well, our children are being impacted in the same way. They're beginning to confuse the notion of real relationships with online relationships. And when they do that, it's a two-way street. It reduces not only the relationships that they have to that forum, I've got this Facebook friend or this Insta friend, but it also affects our ability to make friends in real life. Because what you'll see when we move on is that the more we treat artificial intelligence like real people, the more that Siri or Alexa become a part of our lives. Studies indicate the more we reduce the kindness and the fulfillment that we get from other people. So this is probably one of the more self-evident pieces of this discussion. I think that discovery is something we focus on here at Meadows every day. When I walk around, I'm always so filled with joy about what I see happening in classrooms. And when I say that, you would expect someone to say that. You expect an administrator to say to you, I walk through the school and I see learning happening, and that's what I got into this for. But let me just tell you, I'm coming at this from the outside perspective. I've come from prestigious independent schools. I know what the environment's supposed to look like. And I know that what you have here in this bottle at Meadows is the best combination of innovation and self-determination. You have an audience of students and teachers who are do-it-yourself people. They don't wait around for someone to provide solutions to them. They're teaching your kids to do the same. It's an amazing environment to be in. Unfortunately, we're now tasked with the responsibility of trying to fact check the unbelievably copious amount of false information that comes from social media. So we know that we could log into Facebook and sure enough, within a few minutes, or Instagram or TikTok or anything, we could find a story that we know to be factually inaccurate. We also probably have a set of tools as adults that we've used to suss out the truth in those things, right? We have our peer groups that we talk to. We have our research that we rely on. We have the values our families gave us to fall back on. But this information now is hitting 7 and 8-year-olds who, for all of those things I just discussed, are only in an incubation period, okay? So they don't have the reference. A 7 or 8-year-old hears a story or reads a story from social media or watches a TikTok video that purports something to be true that is not going to retreat back into peer reviewed journals to try to get to the bottom of it. Our best hope is that they'll ask us, but more often not, they don't. Who they'll ask? They'll ask their friends. And so the fact that misinformation can travel at a rate that's 6 times the speed of accurate information is terrifying in these forums, okay? The reason why that happens is because the internet operates on an outrage economy. So no one has ever forwarded to you, look at this perfectly normal picture. No one has ever said, this is me reading, and gotten 10,000 likes, okay? The reason that people have had their admissions into college rescinded, the reason that people, there are people that we know that are famous, and we know them as famous for all the wrong reasons, is because the internet prioritizes outlandish behavior and outlandish claims. And because those things are what attracts people's attention, it spreads that much faster. So now we know that our children have access to an environment more time during the day than they have in conversation with us, and that environment is spreading information that is false 6 times more quickly than accurate information is being spread from it, and that they've got our children's attention for twice as long as we do. It's a pretty formidable challenge to look at. I want to exit this display one more time just so I can take you back to one other slide. Thanks for bearing with me. So there was a time when this reference point was really ideal for students, especially in upper school. It's not so much now, but I think as parents, it's helpful. And I use it as a guide to what I'm going to ask you to do. Maybe you know who these 2 people are in this picture, and maybe you don't know who either of them are. But Alex Honnold on one side and Alexander Supertramp, also known as Chris McCandless, on the other hand. I'm going to just tell you a 1-minute version of their stories. The young man sitting in front of the bus, his name was Chris McCandless. He graduated from Emory University with honors. He came from a really very successful family with private consulting business that was worth in the millions. He had decided, as some college students do, that he was going to eschew his family's privilege, that he wasn't going to be a part of the system. He was going to retreat off the grid and live off the land and return back to the kind of life that America once represented. And so he burned all of his personal identification, walked out of his apartment in Atlanta after he graduated, and wandered across the country. And if the story ended there, it could be an interesting story and a story of courage. He had some great stories as he made his way across the United States, but his ultimate goal was to make it to Alaska. He wanted to live off the land, and he did make it to Alaska. He retreated into the bush, crossed a river, and then he found that bus that you see him sitting in front of. So the end of this story is that Alex retreated to the bus. He found it very difficult to find protein. He tried to eat what was native to the land. And depending on which expert you listen to, he either poisoned himself by eating berries that were not digestible, or he starved to death in the bus that was on the property there. What Alex didn't know is that the river that he had crossed a few months before would thaw and become unpassable. And then the other thing that Alex didn't know is that just about 3/4 of a mile away, there was a bridge that had been built to be able to pass. Either one of those pieces of information would have saved Alex or Chris, depending on how you want to refer to him, would have saved his life. But he didn't have that information. He had the information that he gathered before his journey, and that turned out to be insufficient. Alex Honnold, on the other side, is, I believe, a Las Vegas resident now. You might be familiar with him. He climbed El Capitan without any ropes, any handles, or any safety measures. So he climbed that 3,000-foot wall with just his feet and his hands. And that in and of itself, if I were to tell you, would probably not make him a model of being careful. But if you're familiar with his story, there's a moment, it's well documented in a documentary about his life. There's a moment in it where he sits in a chair and recites with his eyes closed every single step to ascend El Capitan. He literally says, karate kick left, step up right, ear handle to the right, every single step for minutes on minutes. And then you pan back and you see him with a book in his lap, and he's got every one of those steps written down. He's done all of the work that he could do to prepare. But what he continued to do before he eventually scaled, and he did successfully, was he continued to climb. He climbed it all of the time, as often as he could in season, because ever so subtly, the environment could change. And Alex Honnold understood that those subtle environmental changes could be the difference between his mission being a success or not. I think it creates a great dichotomy of personalities as parents. Many of us, and I include myself in this, so please don't take it as a judgment, are really a lot more like Alexander Supertramp. And that's to say that when we decide to buy a device for our kids, we do all of the research, we figure out what's available, we set up our rules, we say, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do, and then we hand the device to them. And that's it. But the environment changes. Circumstances change. The river swells. And if our children are to be able to pass on that river, they need to know. On the other hand, if you're Alex, then every single application that gets installed on your device, you read. Every single new tool that your child is using, you say, show me how you do that. Show me how to do that if I wanted to do it. You have those conversations. You read every single terms of use. When something says it's designed for 13-year-olds and you've got a 9-year-old saying all their friends use it, you say, sorry, can't do it. So that's the story of two Alexes. And I think that the goal from an educational standpoint is for us to be more like Alex Honnold. And I don't say that certainly as a criticism of Chris McCandless, who was brilliant, but as a word of warning that even when we do all of the preparation, the journey is not over. So the Center for Humane Technology are doing an amazing amount of work on redirecting the tools that social media and the internet have. And so this is the core set of principles borrowed liberally from them that they recommend for us as families. The first is to obsess over our values. And I think we just did that, right? We talked about what really matters in our family and made our decisions based on that. The second, strengthen existing brilliance. You know, this is, I think, a subtle difference. What they've said is, we don't always need the next piece of technology. Instead, leverage brain power, leverage the brilliance of our children instead of making it easier. I'll give one example if I could. And that was this last weekend, I was with my son. He decided he wanted to build a boat. And the easiest thing to do would have been YouTube pontoon boat and watch 12 minutes of videos. And we would have known, we literally would have been experts at building soda bottle pontoon boats within 10 minutes. There's no question. And our way took a lot longer, okay? Because what we did instead was he built the first version and then we went out and we put it out and we realized that's not working. The boat's flipping over. Well, what did we learn from that? The pontoons need to be wider. Okay, well, let's do it again. Iterative learning by using existing brilliance as opposed to the shortcut of technology. Enable wise choices. I think that one of the misnomers in these conversations is that the best thing to do is take away all choice from our children. And that's not the case, because we know that there's always an equal and opposite force and resistance. And so the far better channel is to educate ourselves concurrently with our children and then ask them, well, what do you think? Do you think that's appropriate for you? Do you think you could navigate that safely? Take their input seriously. Nurture mindfulness. This may be the most significant thing we do. The one thing that we are losing in our children because of their use of social media and their use of technology is their ability to be present. 78% in a recent study indicated that they thought it was completely appropriate to text or answer emails while they're having a conversation with their friends. And if you walk around schools, malls, anywhere, do malls exist anymore? Whatever the new mall is, you'll see kids who have come together to spend the day together, who are still just looking down at screens while talking to each other. They are challenged more than ever to be present. And so what we can do to assist with that is to encourage them to be in the present. And then finally, bind growth with responsibility. I think that the gist of this message is that instead of saying, when you're 10, you can do that, when you're 11, and creating these sort of arbitrary points of entry, we bind that growth with responsibility. Every time our child demonstrates how responsible they are, we look at that as an opportunity to say, you know what, you've demonstrated to me that you can handle this, so I'm going to give you this opportunity. But to have those two things be connected, growth and responsibility, is a critical step. I have listed a series of resources here that I think will help you. I strongly, if you haven't already gathered, encourage that you check the Center for Humane Technology. There's a typo there. It's not human, it's humane. I apologize for that. But all of these are of value. Even the larger companies and ecosystems like Apple and Google have tools within their ecosystems to help you manage your child's access. They make strong recommendations about what you can and can't do, or should and should not do. Those will be helpful in navigating. And then at the end of the day, I think that the thing that we all need to keep in mind is that we are fighting a battle with a force that is evolving, that has no obligation to announce its evolution to us, and already has more of our children's attention than we do. And if we don't take that as a serious challenge to say we have to find a way to combat these tools, then we'll leave ourselves in a situation where we will always be the underdogs in instilling core values like the ones we talked about today. So I hope that that's a helpful start to this conversation. I want to save enough time to answer questions, so I'm gonna stop there and turn it over. And I'm happy to stick around and answer as many questions as you might have.
Thank you, Joe. Some great advice, some great things to think about, and it's a big subject, as you said. So we're going to continue these conversations, hopefully in person in the fall. So if there's anybody who has some questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask Joe, or you can raise your hand, and Courtney or I will call on you. No questions, it looks like.
Oh, I have a quick question, Joe.
Jeremy, yep.
As a parent,
Sure.
my son, as you know, is 10, and he's a big Minecraft guy.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, the analogy that you used about the two Alexes, I think, is exactly dead on. Because, man, I knew what I was doing when we got into Roblox. And then since then, I haven't sort of kept up on what's going on. And so are there resources, or are there sort of outside resources that we can point one another to on all of these different platforms? Or is it really a kind of like, one at a time, you have to do your due diligence on everyone and keep up with how the kids are, because the way Jack uses Minecraft right now is totally different than the way he used it a year ago, right? It's much more social now. He's growing, and it's become a sort of platform for him and his friends. So his use is changing, even though the platform hasn't changed.
So there are two things that I would say to that. Number one is that it's important for parents to understand that there is an ed tech industrial complex. There is very literally, this morning I read an article written by an ed tech innovator that said TikTok is the future of education. And immediately I was, I picked my jaw up off the ground and took the time to read the article. And what her argument was ultimately was that because kids opt into TikTok instead of being enrolled, that they pay closer attention. Totally unsubstantiated, floating all over the internet. And it turns out that she, like I said, she has a platform that is essentially a video sharing platform that she wants schools to buy. So there's this enormous growth, mission creep of these tools into education. So the first thing is, as a parent, is nothing is as it seems. So you will be told, well, they use these in school. This is a great tool for school. That is in no way a guarantee that it aligns with your core values, unless you know that the person who approved it aligns with your core values and you trust their ability to continue to monitor things. The second, and this is, I recommended this in the first conversation that we had last week, is that you should subscribe to at least one tech aggregator blog site. Any one, doesn't matter. TechCrunch, any of these things. EdTech Daily. I have one that I hosted that was on the my former school's website, so that parents could just subscribe to that. And we're hoping to start one here. But if you just, as my father did for years and years, if you just read the headlines, my dad was satisfied to read the headlines in the paper, and it made for some really muddled storytelling. But at the end of the day, if you're doing that with the technology feeds, then you're aware of at least the conversations that are happening about these tools. And I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I'll say again, you should not take anything at face value. This morning I read an article by an educator who said TikTok was the future of education in America. And if that doesn't tell you how far off there is a capital influence in these tools that makes them unworthy to be considered trusted partners. And so finding third-party research, finding people in your schools that are knowledgeable, like Ms. Friedman, and saying, is this something that my kid is ready for? People who are also doing the work to stay current. That's your best solution.
Thank you.
Joe, I think it's important to reiterate what you said last week, and you said it again briefly today, of that advice you had as parents, the show me how to and show me how you. Could you just maybe repeat that? Because I thought that was really important advice.
Sure. One of the things, and that's what Ms. Kennedy is referring to in our talk last week. One of the things that I did was say, these are the 4 or 5 things that you should do before you ever give a child a device. And then we spoke afterwards, and Ms. Kennedy was like, a lot of these kids already have devices. And I said, you're kidding. What, kindergartners? So, and I was a little bit surprised. So one of the best tools for keeping track of how your kids use their devices is a question. I call it, show me how to, and show me how you. If you constantly remember those 2 questions, sit down with your kids and say, show me how to create this, this account in Discord. How does that work? And then show me how you are using Minecraft. What is the most recent thing you did? Children still love to show us what they can do, right? They love to demonstrate to us the power, and they don't need to know that what you're really doing when you watch that is figuring out, is everything that the steps they're taking here, is this something I'm comfortable with? Is this safe? And the one thing that Ms. Kennedy that I didn't get to discuss, and I always feel like we have to rush through because there's so much to talk about. There may be people on this call who are thinking, my child has TikTok already, or my child has Snapchat already, and what do I do now? And my answer to you is really very, very simple. One of the greatest things that you could do for your child is to go back and sit down and say, you know what? We made a mistake. We thought this was the right time for you to have this, but now we know this, this, and this is the reason that we can't say now unfettered access to this tool. And it's not just because you're owning a mistake. There's value in that, obviously. I don't need to give you the counseling angle. The real value is you're showing your child that circumstances change, and that these apps and these tools change, and that it's good for them to reflect. So that when they encounter that moment in an application or in Discord or whatever, when someone says something that they know falls well outside of their core value system, they've already had the model of what it looks like to say, this isn't for me, I got to back out. And kids tend to feel like they can't do that. So giving them that demonstration, hey, I made a mistake. This isn't what I thought it was. I got to take it back. It might seem punitive at first, but boy, it sets an example that will really, in the long run, benefit children in an evolving environment.
Joe, we have a question in the chat about safety. A parent who's asking about texting, particularly texting strangers, and as a parent, finding out about it before it becomes dangerous. So any advice there?
Man, yeah, wow. Everyone, whenever I have these conversations, I always come away grateful that we had them, but I also, put on my parent hat and just think, oh, what are we gonna do? In the first conversation I talked about last week, I talked about the iPod Touch and how so many parents bought the first generation iPod Touch because they said, it looks like a phone, but my child won't be able to network with other kids, and they'll be able to have music, and they'll have this and they'll have that, until there was an iOS update. And all of a sudden, every one of those things could FaceTime and text. And countless parents had no idea that this device they'd given their child now could receive messages from strangers. And so there are things inside the link that I sent specifically to the ecosystems that give you like read receipts. So if you've decided that you need your child to be able to text because when they're at their sports events and those types of things, it's how they let you know that you need to pick them up and all of those things. There are things within each of these ecosystems that you can use to manage those tools and to limit those tools. So I would encourage you to look in those. Again, I plan on this. I'll give you the PDF export of these, which has links to most of those ecosystems. The second is, I would say, less from a safety standpoint, but more from a data protection standpoint, that you should try to make sure that you know what the data retention policies are of the company that you choose to use for that exchange. So like a lot of people use WhatsApp as a tool, and I don't want to pick on the WhatsApp folks, but they don't exactly have a great history as far as protecting people's data. It's an entirely separate conversation, but one of the things that we absolutely should be doing with our children to help prevent what happened to this generation from happening to the next is teaching our children that their data is a commodity. It's being treated as a commodity by adults. It's being sold as a commodity by adults, and who are making billions of dollars off of it. And we give it away every day without even thinking about who we're giving it to and what their use is. If we raise a generation of kids who see their data, their tracking history, as something that's of value, literal monetary value, then they won't give it away so freely. And then the last thing I would say, Ms. Kennedy, is that as recent as this week, Apple released an update on their phones, which allows you to opt out of third-party application tracking. So I would encourage anybody that's in that ecosystem to download that update to their iOS and turn off the app tracking information so that you would start to protect your child's data at an early age, and set that sort of as the standard for how you would do it. But yes, the risks of text are more limited if you use an ecosystem texting system. So if you're on an iPhone, it is safer for you to use iMessage because you can have access to all of those. The moment they get third-party applications to chat on, whether it's WhatsApp or Snapchat, it becomes much, much harder to regulate what they see, who they talk to.
Thank you.
And I didn't see that question. So if there is another one, please let me know and I'll make sure we answer it.
I don't see any more questions or hands. Courtney, do you see any?
I don't. Okay. And I have these conversations with your students regularly. I mean, about their information and how to protect it, and why we have usernames, and when we use our email address, and when we use some unique other username so that people can't identify them, and why, and all that stuff. I mean, I try, but I can only do so much. And so I'm welcome to take any suggestions from you. If there are things you're concerned about, please feel free to reach out to me so that we can figure out how to address them with the kids the best way possible. Also.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great point. Yeah, we need feedback to make sure we certainly cover digital citizenship from a young age and repeatedly. But as Joe said, it's just always changing. So to keep up is
all the time.
tough work. Yeah. So, well, thank you, everybody.
So much of our, I'm sorry, Ms. Kennedy.
Joe.
I was just going to say, so much of our digital citizenship, it's incredibly valuable because it addresses, how we are going to interact with other people and how we treat other people. So it aligns very much with our core values. The challenge is when those folks that they end up with don't share those core values, and that's what we really need to sort of give our attention to, is because this isn't a level playing field, and our values and your family's values don't have a level playing field in these environments. So it means that we have to compete that much harder to make sure that our message is heard.
I think I would encourage you to communicate with each other too as parents, especially if your children are friends and spending a lot of time together, to make sure that your values align, and when you send them to someone else's house or vice versa, you know what to expect from them. I think that's really important because I hear that a lot from kids.
Miss Heron, the point she just posted in the chat that our children are much smarter than we are, and that's actually something we addressed in the first conversation too. Is that part of what we need to do is sort of turn upside down the notion of expertism, because while our children are much smarter on devices than we are, they are not much smarter on parenting, and so we can learn from them. But at the end of the day, we have to sort of turn the expert model on its head and say, well, you know better how to run, how to play Minecraft. I know better how to protect your brain and to give it room to grow and do those things. And I know so many of our parents are doing that already, but we're still the boss. It is an interesting, turning the apple crate on expertism over, especially in a country that's so focused on expertism as a core value. So,
great. I think that's a great point to end on. Thank you so much, Joe. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Have a great day.